Chapter 15. We had seen the light in Mama's eyes, and we had heard her words on the phone. "In Seattle! Next week! How wonderful!" The rest of Mama's day was divided between moving all the furniture in the house and trying on every dress in her closet. We learned that a great event was coming to Seattle, and we were going to see it. Not quite as monumental as seeing Presidential Harding granted, but much more enjoyable. We wouldn't have to sit on a camp stool on the side of the road. We will be sitting in the plush seats of the Pantages Theater. During the activity, she repeated the stories we had heard a dozen times before about the great John Olson, her classmate in Wabash, Indiana, who after graduation from high school had gone out into the world and become a big name in the entertainment business. At dinner, while Mama fluttered around in the kitchen far behind schedule, Papa explained to us with an air of confidentiality. John Olson was Mama's old flame. "What's old flame, Papa?" Flora asked, putting the newly washed napkins into the napkin rings. "An old flame is a fellow that makes a girl's eyes light up." When Mama finally came to the table with the bowl of boiled potatoes, we could see that her eyes were definitely lit up. Papa suggested, "Maybe you can ask him out for dinner, and you can get him to listen to our little stage show and give his professional opinion." Mom's eyes brightened even more. Our little stage show had been in the making as far back as I can remember. Papa taught us to sing harmony and accompany ourselves on ukuleles. Mama objected to some of the songs. "Roy, please don't sing those songs in front of the girls." "My songs aren't going to break their delicate ears. They'll learn about these things soon enough." Mama certainly hoped not. She taught us songs too, but we didn't care much for her songs or her demonstrations. They only emphasized Mama's biggest failing. She couldn't sing worth a darn. Her shaky efforts puckered my sense of pitch, and I'd end up begging, "Mama, we don't need a trio." Mama's piano playing wasn't much better. She had learned to play the notes exactly as written, and her abilities ended there. If perchance the sheet of music had a printer's error, Mama's ear would never have detected it. She could have played over the same passage until the saints went marching in and never been the wiser. Flora and I knew she had gone wrong somewhere, but not knowing how to correct it, we just considered her musical talents in the same category as her other shortcomings, too ladylike. We wondered how Mama had been able to play in a dance band. We also knew how dedicated Mama was to practicing. Dor said, "She thumps on me when I'm in bed with her, and it gives me bruises and I have to wake her up and tell her to stop playing the piano on me." I often wondered why Papa's singing was so fun, while Mama's was tedious, like learning the ABCs at school. Many of our questions were answered one day when Papa was discussing such matters with Joe Bowen, the manager at the Seward Park bathing beach. Joe often dropped in to visit Papa, discuss our swimming, and expound on the new theories he was learning at the University of Washington. He insisted that only certain natural responses like sneezing, coughing, digestion, fear, and anger were instinctive. Everything else was learned from our environment. Papa insisted that other traits, such as the ability to sing, were inborn. His bottom-line argument involved me. "You can't tell me that Franny's ability to sing is learned. She had that on the day she was born." Joe was insistent. "From the time that Fran was born, she heard you singing. She began imitating you. From the very first you'd say, 'How pretty little Franny sings.' And she learned that singing was a way of getting your attention." If I understood Joe's theories correctly, I'd have said that Mama's musical traits were certainly environmental. But what she lacked in talent, she made up for in persistence. She practiced with us, sewed costumes that matched our songs, and became our booking agent. By the time I started school at Big Brighton, we were singing at PTA meetings and other community affairs. We became so well known that the Post-Intelligencer printed a picture of us in our Japanese costumes, and someone, Mr. Dim Wit perhaps, hung it on the bulletin board at Brighton School. From then on, Flora and I became the school snobs. As usual, Mama's enthusiasm outran her abilities. Some parts of our costumes were tricky, most notably my wig for the Japanese Sandman. Actually, I was the Sand Lady, and Florence was the Sandman. The wig was black yarn stitched over a gray stocking. Instead of staying snugly in place, it kept creeping up. If I didn't spend most of my time on stage trying to pull it down, I ended up with the excess scalp hanging from the top of my head. Many an audience wondered what such a deformity had to do with Japan. Dor had observed how much praise Flora and I were getting and wanted into the act, so Mama gave her vocal exercises. It wasn't a good idea. Dor's voice started sounding thin and squeaky like Mama's. It seemed to prove Joe's theory about singing being environmental. Papa mentioned this to Joe one day, who replied, "Well, you haven't been telling her how nicely she sings." Papa said no, he hadn't, because she didn't. "Well then, get busy and tell her how nicely she sings." Papa tried, but it didn't help. He was glad. Not glad that Dor's singing didn't improve, but glad that it disproved at least one of Joe's theories. Finally, Papa had suggested to Mama, "You'd better find Dor a part that doesn't involve singing." Mama agreed, and set to work on a colorful costume. "You can be a little gypsy in the Gypsy Love Song." She gave her a little rug and pillow, and told her to go on stage and sleep by the stew pot, while Flora and I sang, "Slumber on, my little gypsy sweetheart. Dream of the field and the groove." Our first performances were spectacular. Mama claimed she added just the right touch, and in fact she did. When the great Olsen and Johnson show arrived in town, Mama took us backstage. "Tenny!" John Olsen caught Mama up in his arms and swung her around. When he finally set her down, I could see that her eyes were definitely lit up. Then, he introduced us to people wearing the brightest makeup and the most fabulous costumes one could ever imagine. Old Johnson had the biggest, funniest, floppiest shoes that we had ever seen, and he kept stepping on our toes and making us squeal with delight. As special guests of John Olsen, we were ushered to the best seats in the house and sat in a state of bliss through the whole performance. The next day, Mama kept us busy moving furniture and stacking magazines. Every 10 minutes, she'd rush to the piano, play an introduction, and we'd be into the act. Flora complained, "If we keep this up, I'm going to be too hoarse to sing." From the time that John entered the house, everything was in an uproar. After dinner, Mama had us change into our gypsy costumes and glissando. We were performing before the great comedian. When we finished, Mr. Olsen was very enthusiastic about our talents. He said Mama was a great director, Florence and I were good at harmonizing, and Dor did a very good job of sleeping. No telling what she would do if she ever woke up. Papa must have figured Mr. Olsen would know something about the development of specific traits, and introduced the subject of heredity and environment. John answered, "Well, I'm no specialist, but from my experience, I'd say you're either born with it or you ain't. And hearing Franny sing, I'd say she was born with it." I was in a state of euphoria. His words were some of the most glorious that I had ever heard. I dared to dream that one day I might be a singer. From then on, Mama intensified her labors, teaching us new songs, planning new costumes, and taking us to see other stage shows and vaudeville acts at the Pantages and Orpheum theaters. She also started Flora and I on piano lessons. For years, I have made the claim that a broken arm had hampered my opportunities of becoming a concert pianist. This statement does not seem strange until one considered that the arm of which I speak was not my own arm. Fact of the matter is, I never even saw the broken arm. I only heard about it one spring afternoon when Mama and Mrs. Williams were out near the car, bound for the garden club. Mrs. Williams remarked, "Did you hear that Albert Benfield broke his arm?" Of course Mama hadn't heard. From whom would she hear such news except from Mrs. Williams? Unfortunately, Mama started the engine, so I missed the gory details, which I'm sure were full of agony and pain, because Mrs. Williams never allowed her stories to get dull. Everybody at our house knew who Albert was. He was one of the smart Alec kids who had heckled us on our baseball diamond until Papa had threatened to knock his block off. Albert had yelled back in his funny, scratchy voice, "You and who else?" Shortly after that, Albert had caught lice in the old chicken house and ended up with a pig shave. He blamed Papa for that, although we couldn't figure out why. They certainly weren't Papa's lice. I knew the reason for Albert's scratchy voice. Albert was going through the change of life. I'd heard Mama and Mary Bird discussing changes. It seemed that boys and old ladies, like Bertha Landis, the mayor of Seattle, for instance, went through some kind of alteration. You could tell that boys were going through it because their voices got squeaky. How you could tell that old women went through it I didn't know, but I assumed that their voices changed as well. After hearing about Albert's arm, I had hunted down Dorothy, who was sitting with Robbie on the back steps near the garbage can. They were putting doll clothes on Gray Kitty. I told them the news, relishing every word. They were as delighted as I was, figuring that Albert was finally getting his comeuppance, and that if he came around to beat us up, he'd be hampered considerably. Dor was trying to force the cat's paw through a tiny sleeve. "I wonder how much of his arm is broke off," she said. I wasn't sure, but felt safe in saying, "It's all off." "What do people do with arms that get broken off?" Dorothy wondered. Robbie had the answer. "They just throw 'em in the garbage can." He was probably influenced by the fact that he was sitting right next to one. Duncan came by and, being the senior member of the group, straightened us out. They don't either throw 'em in the garbage can, because the dogs would dig 'em out and chew on 'em and leave 'em laying around some guy's front yard. Gosh, who would want Albert's bones laying around in the front yard? I said. Dunny continued. They take 'em to the cemetery and bury 'em and have a tombstone that says, "Here lies Albert Benfield's arm." Port arrived. Yeah, and when Albert dies, they put him in the same grave, and all they have to do is scratch out the word arm from the tombstone. Yeah, I got an uncle who was hit by a train, and his tombstone says, "Here lies Uncle Andy's 2 legs and what they could find of the rest of him," Dunny said. You read all kinds of stuff like that in graveyards. Dor and Robbie had Gray Kitty all dressed up and tried to get him to walk down the steps. He was so constricted that he could hardly move. "You're going to kill that cat," Dunny said, "but you won't be able to send him to the graveyard. They only have black cats in the graveyards," Port said. When Mama called us in to set the table, I said to Dor, "Golly, I wonder what it's like to have only one arm." Dor didn't stop to wonder. She stuck one arm inside her dress and started up the stairs. Thus began the Bigham broken arm experiment. For weeks we did everything with just one arm, set the table, ate our oatmeal, made our bed. It annoyed Mama terribly. Not only were we doing a poor job of everything, but we were also tearing out the seams on all of our dresses. During all this, the thought of Albert's accident went around my brain like jingle bells at Christmas. I needed no clues, no introductions. At any moment, whether inside or out, I'd simply burst out, "Albert Benfield broke his arm." Mama was annoyed. "What will the neighbors think when you're always singing at the top of your lungs about Albert's arm?" More to the point, what would Albert think? Papa cautioned. The idea stopped me cold. I became more frightened of this neighborhood bull than ever. I was afraid to leave the yard for fear that he would catch me and beat me up. In my nightmares, I'd be sleepwalking on the roof, and he would come and push me off. Eventually, though, I was able to stash him in the back of my mind and dwell on other vicissitudes of life, like piano lessons. Mrs. Williams had recommended a piano teacher who lived several blocks away. From the very first, I didn't get our teacher's name, but that didn't matter. She was not one to stand on formalities. We always referred to her as Mrs. Music Lady. I enjoyed the cozy atmosphere of Mrs. Music Lady's house. The miscellaneous furnishings were grouped by the windows, and the old ornate piano was placed against the wall. Except for having to read the little black dots, dashes, and squiggles in the music book, I enjoyed my lessons. As I sat at the piano playing, I was often aware of other activities going on behind me. The old, decrepit cat sharpening her paws on the old sofa, the neighbor lady coming over to bring roses, or the thud of books being thrown on the table, accompanied by a scratchy voice. "Hi, Mom. Can I go to Pete's house after I change my clothes?" Mrs. Music Lady's voice, often in time to the metronome, was gentle. "Yes, dear, but don't be wild." Then she would say to me, "Just go on playing, dear." I did. It began to appear that Mama's hopes of having a concert pianist in the family might be coming true. In the meantime, Dor had been inspired by Mr. Olson's words too, and continued to insist on having a bigger part in our little stage show. If Mama can play the piano in her sleep, I should be able to do something in my sleep too. We couldn't imagine what that might be, but we soon learned. We were singing at the Elks Club. Mama was always anxious for us to do well there, not only because of Papa's connections, but, with the colored stage lights and velvet curtains, it was a more professional setting than PTA meetings. On this day, everything was going as scheduled. Mama playing our accompaniment, Flora and I singing beautifully, and Dor sleeping. Suddenly there were titters from the audience. Bewildered, I looked to Flora. She was steadfastly singing her part and refused to look at me. I began to suspect Dor, but, from what I could observe, she was just laying quietly by the stew pot. The audience response continued to increase. In fact, an occasional full-bellied laugh could be heard above the tittering. About halfway through, Mama began to miss notes, and when I looked over, I could see that she was making the kind of face that a child interprets as meaning, "Wait till I get you home." To whom the faces were being directed, I couldn't tell, because Mama's abilities didn't allow her to keep her eyes off the music for more than a split second. There was nothing else to do but keep on singing right on through the finale, a breathtaking high B flat, which I hit full voice. It had always brought down the house before. Unfortunately, the house had already been brought down. It wasn't until Dorothy swaggered off the stage and Mama caught her by the ear that Flora and I understood who the culprit was. However, we had to wait until we got home to hear the full report. Mama told Papa, She opened her eyes and rolled them around, and when people laughed, she stuck out her tongue. Papa responded, "Well, I think your friend John would say that there's nothing wrong with a good comedy routine." Mama was indignant. It was not designed to be a comedy routine. Papa's final words on the matter were, "Dorothy, you are never to open your eyes on stage again.